The heavy, rhythmic drum of the Parisian rain against the canvas awning of the café felt like a solid barrier, separating them from the rest of the world. Inside their small, dimly lit bubble at the edge of the Latin Quarter, the scent of rich espresso and damp wool hung thick in the air. Elara and Liam, both exhausted but strangely wired from their demanding literary study trip, sat huddled over a tiny, circular wooden table. The ancient streets beyond the fogged glass were a constant blur of sweeping headlights and hurried, umbrella-shielded silhouettes, but their entire universe was currently contained within the worn, leather covers of a book resting between their coffee cups. Elara pushed a damp, dark curl away from her eyes, her focus absolute. She was a creature of pure intuition, a student who felt the heavy emotion of history just as much as she studied its clinical facts. In her hands was an antique poetry volume she had unearthed earlier that afternoon from a dusty, entirely neglected box at the back of a small bookstore near the Seine. Its pages were incredibly brittle, yellowed with decades of age, and smelled of forgotten centuries and dry ink. "I'm telling you, Liam, there is something completely unnatural about the binding right here," she murmured, running her delicate fingers slowly along the spine. "Look at the stitching. It's uneven, as if someone opened it and carefully sewed it back together a long time ago." Liam leaned closer, adjusting his posture. Where Elara was driven by feeling and narrative, Liam was firmly anchored by logic and rigid structure. He was the pragmatic one of their duo, the sharp-minded scholar who thrived on complex historical puzzles and verifiable facts. He gently took the book from her outstretched hands, his thumb precisely tracing the subtle anomaly she had pointed out. "You might actually be right," he conceded, his voice low, suddenly tinged with a sharp spark of curiosity. "The thread used here is cotton, not the original silk binding that would have been standard in the late 19th century. Someone intentionally tampered with this." Driven by a sudden, intense impulse that she couldn't fully explain, Elara reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a small, silver letter opener. With agonizing, breathless care, she slipped the thin blade beneath the suspect stitching. Liam didn't attempt to stop her. Instead, he watched in complete silence as the old, degrading threads gave way with a soft, yielding snap. From the hidden, hollow cavity within the spine, a tightly folded piece of aged parchment slipped out, landing silently on the wooden table between them. The ambient noise of the café, the clinking of ceramic cups, the low murmur of other patrons, the jazz playing softly from a corner speaker, seemed to instantly evaporate. They both stared at the paper as if it were a live wire. With trembling, careful fingers, Liam slowly unfolded it. It was not a forgotten poem. It was a chaotic, mesmerizing labyrinth of archaic symbols, astrological numbers, and elegant, sweeping handwriting that looked almost frantic in its execution. "This handwriting," Elara whispered, her breath catching in her throat as she leaned over the fragile document. "I've spent the last 3 months analyzing his original manuscripts for my final thesis. I would recognize those aggressive loops and sharp angles anywhere. Liam, this is his exact handwriting." "The poet." Liam's eyes widened dramatically, his pragmatic mind racing through the historical timeline they had been studying all semester. "That is completely impossible. According to every single academic record, his final letters and his unreleased masterpiece were completely lost in the tragic fire of 1891. Nothing survived. If this document is authentic, then history is entirely wrong," Elara finished for him, a fierce thrill of adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Look right here. These aren't just random, meaningless symbols. They are precise astrological coordinates mixed with complex numerical ciphers." Liam immediately pulled a blank notebook and a pen from his bag, the dedicated academic in him completely taking over. The heavy exhaustion of the day vanished, instantly replaced by an electric, shared focus. They worked seamlessly together, forming a perfect symbiosis of their distinct strengths. Elara quickly identified the obscure literary references hidden within the French text, while Liam methodically applied substitution ciphers to the numbers, breaking down the geometric logic of the ancient puzzle. Minutes quickly turned into intense hours. The rain continued to wash the dark Parisian streets outside, but they were entirely lost in a private world of century-old secrets. Slowly, agonizingly, the chaotic symbols began to form a coherent, undeniable message. "It's a specific location," Liam finally breathed, his pen hovering over the decoded phrase. "It's not just a letter. It's a map." The coordinates point directly to a restricted, forgotten sector of the old Sorbonne archives. Elara looked up, her eyes locking deeply with his. The academic thrill of the discovery was intoxicating, but beneath it, a new, profound connection was taking firm root between them. They were no longer just classmates on a study trip, they were the sole keepers of a dangerous secret that could rewrite literary history. The first piece of the puzzle was solved, and as they stared at the coordinates, they both silently understood that their true journey into the shadows of Paris had only just begun. The transition from the warm, perfumed cocoon of the café into the biting reality of the Parisian night was brutal, yet it only heightened the palpable electricity crackling between Elara and Liam. Guided by the geometric coordinates they had deciphered, they hurried into the pouring rain. Their footsteps echoed in a determined cadence against the slick cobblestones of the Latin Quarter. Deliberately avoiding the brightly lit boulevards, they plunged into the dark, centuries-old alleyways winding around the prestigious Sorbonne. Their shoulders brushed intimately with every hasty step under their small, shared umbrella, sending an unfamiliar shiver down Elara's neck. Their destination was a forgotten, highly restricted library annex. It was a majestic stone building with a facade deeply blackened by time, its iron-grated windows jealously guarding the secrets of the past. Reaching the heavy oak doors, flanked by stone gargoyles eroded by endless rain, Liam hesitated. The place looked completely abandoned. However, Elara, driven by fierce intuition, spotted a heavily tarnished brass plaque. Without a second thought, she firmly pressed the bell concealed deep within the damp shadows of the alcove. Agonizing minutes ticked by in heavy silence, broken only by the crash of rain against the zinc gutters. Suddenly, the massive door cracked open with a drawn-out creak, revealing the hunched silhouette of an elderly librarian. His piercing eyes, magnified by thick glasses, scrutinized the drenched students with undisguised suspicion. This was an exclusive club, a fiercely guarded sanctuary for elite researchers. They realized instantly they would have to be clever to gain entry. Stepping forward with unwavering confidence, Elara began to speak. Her voice was calm but laced with absolute determination. She didn't plead. Instead, she boldly invoked the spirit of the cursed poet. From pure memory, she recited incredibly obscure fragments of his unpublished correspondence, weaving in vivid historical details about 19th-century Paris that only a true, dedicated scholar could know. The hard, defensive gaze of the seasoned guardian slowly softened. Recognizing the genuine flame of literary research burning within her, he silently stepped aside, granting them passage. They cautiously entered a vestibule plunged in deep twilight, leaving the modern noise of the city behind. The interior was the ultimate dream of any bibliophile, a sprawling, multi-level labyrinth where dark wood shelves stretched upward toward a vaulted ceiling. They groaned under the immense weight of thousands of dusty manuscripts and leather-bound ledgers. The air was thick with the intoxicating perfume of aged paper, beeswax, and centuries of undisturbed academic silence. Following the sequence of the encrypted code, they descended a narrow spiral staircase into the silent crypts of the basement. The light was incredibly scarce, filtered weakly through flickering bulbs that cast dancing shadows against the damp stone walls. They worked harmoniously in this heavy semi-darkness, a silent synchronicity naturally taking hold. Liam's highly methodical mind rapidly scanned the archaic indexing, efficiently translating historical references into physical markers. Meanwhile, Elara's intuition guided her hands smoothly over the fragile spines of the volumes most severely ravaged by time. Finally, hidden at the very back of the room, wedged behind a massive row of cadastral registers dating back to the Grand Haussmann renovations, Liam extracted a slender, cardboard portfolio. It was securely sealed by a frayed, black silk ribbon. Holding their breath, their shoulders pressing together in the tight space, they opened it with infinite precaution upon a small reading desk. Inside, protected between two sheets of yellowed glacine paper, lay the true object of their frantic quest. It was a highly complex, transparent overlay, a tracing map dating back well over a century. The intricate lines, drawn in India ink that had faded to a ghostly sepia, revealed the entirety of the Parisian underground network as it existed long before modern municipal renovations. The sweeping lines pointed directly toward abandoned phantom metro stations and deeply buried ventilation shafts permanently erased from official maps. Elara slowly raised her head, her dark eyes shining with a potent mixture of academic admiration and raw adrenaline. Liam met her intense gaze, a beautifully triumphant smile illuminating his usually serious, highly controlled features. Their faces were separated by mere inches, hovering just above the priceless antique map. The shared success of this dizzying discovery, the thrill of outsmarting the Guardian, and the magic of this place suspended outside of time firmly cemented their partnership. The academic distance that had separated them at the beginning of the afternoon had irrevocably evaporated. The fragile romance that had taken root at the cafe was rapidly forging into a bond of rare intensity, a perfect alchemy between two beautifully complementary minds. They were no longer simple classmates, they were the united guardians of a secret transcending history. But just as they were delicately packing the overlay away, a sharp, metallic noise suddenly shattered the peaceful silence, echoing violently from the upper floor. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of a massive lock being brutally forced open, followed instantly by a set of heavy, predatory footsteps that sounded nothing like the shuffling gait of the elderly librarian. The real adventure, dark and incredibly dangerous, had just caught up to them in the crypt. The dull, rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps echoed down the narrow spiral staircase, striking the damp stone walls of the crypt with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. Elara and Liam, frozen in absolute shock over the priceless tracing map they had just unearthed, exchanged a look of pure, visceral panic. The quiet academic thrill of their discovery had been violently shattered, replaced by the suffocating grip of immediate danger. Without uttering a single word, Liam grabbed Elara's arm, pulling her firmly into the thick shadows of a recessed alcove, hiding just behind the massive oak shelf holding the Haussmann cadastral registers. They held their breath, their hearts hammering against their ribs, just as an imposing silhouette appeared in the arched doorway of the basement. The flickering, yellowish light of the dying bulbs revealed a man of chilling, almost anachronistic elegance. He wore a heavy, custom-tailored dark wool overcoat, its collar turned up against the biting dampness of the Parisian night. In his right hand, tightly gripped by a fine leather glove, he carried a walking stick with a silver pommel, which he struck against the uneven flagstones with a deeply menacing authority. This was clearly no ordinary librarian checking the grounds, nor a security guard on a routine patrol. The predatory confidence in his every movement betrayed a man of immense wealth and ruthless power. He was a shadow collector, a dangerous rival willing to do absolutely anything to claim the poet's final secrets. The man stepped slowly toward the heavy wooden reading desk they had hastily abandoned just seconds ago. He ran a gloved finger over the dusty surface, his piercing, calculating eyes sweeping through the impenetrable darkness of the room. "I know perfectly well that you are still down here," the man murmured. His voice was smooth but sharp as a razor, echoing mournfully through the confined space of the archive. You were remarkably clever to find this forgotten annex, I will gladly grant you that. But you are playing a very dangerous game, one where you understand neither the rules nor the true stakes. Simply hand over whatever you just found, and you can both return to your peaceful, innocent literary studies unharmed. Elara's chest heaved painfully as she struggled to breathe silently. Instinctively, she squeezed Liam's hand with all her remaining strength. He responded with a solid, reassuring pressure, his eyes finally adjusting to the gloom as he frantically scanned the darkness for any possible escape route. Behind them, half concealed by a precarious stack of moldy newspapers, Liam spotted a small, rusted iron grate covering an old coal chute that led up to the street level. It was narrow and filthy, but it was their only absolute chance of survival. While the collector inspected the opposite aisle, his back momentarily turned, Liam gave Elara a subtle nod. Moving with an agonizingly slow precision, carefully avoiding the slightest rustle of their damp clothes against the stone, they crept toward the grate. Liam pulled Elara's silver letter opener from his pocket, using the sturdy metal to pry at the rusted latch. The stubborn iron gave way with a sharp, agonizing squeal that sounded entirely deafening in the dead silence of the crypt. The man whipped around instantly, sweeping the room with the blinding, harsh beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight. "You insolent fools," he spat with venomous contempt, lunging toward them with terrifying, unexpected speed. "Go, Elara. Now!" Liam shouted. He slammed his shoulder into the heavy grate, bursting it open into the wet alleyway above, and practically shoved the young woman through the narrow opening before frantically scrambling up behind her. They dragged themselves into the freezing, torrential downpour, covered in century-old soot and gasping for air. The narrow, winding alley behind the Sorbonne offered little cover, and the furious shouts of the collector echoed from the grate below. They didn't look back. They sprinted blindly into the storm, bursting out onto the vast, open expanse of the Place du Panthéon. The majestic, ghostly dome of the monument loomed dramatically against the ink-black sky, illuminated by the jittery glow of the street lamps. Suddenly, the aggressive screech of tires against wet cobblestones pierced the night. A sleek, powerful black sedan drifted dangerously around the corner, violently blocking their path. The door flew open, and the collector emerged, his usually impassive face now twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The quiet, academic hunt had just escalated into a brutal street chase. "Keep running!" Liam roared, pulling Elara away from the glaring headlights. They dashed across the monumental square, narrowly dodging the slick, rain-filled potholes. Their lungs burned, but Elara's intuitive knowledge of the district's historical architecture saved them. She led them into a dizzying maze of steep staircases, hidden cobblestone courtyards, and narrow, covered passages near the Rue Mouffetard, places entirely inaccessible to the heavy luxury car. When they finally collapsed under the protective awning of a closed bakery, soaked to the bone and shivering violently from cold and pure adrenaline, the heavy silence of the night slowly returned. Liam carefully pulled the transparent overlay from his bag, anxiously checking that it was safe from the rain. Looking at each other in the dim light, they felt a terrifying chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This was no longer a romantic puzzle for brilliant students. The delicate world of poetry had just violently collided with a harsh, deadly reality. The stakes were now absolute, but as Liam saw the fierce, unyielding fire burning in Elara's dark eyes, he knew neither of them would ever turn back. The freezing rain dripping from the bakery awning felt like ice against their skin, but the adrenaline still surging through their veins kept the cold at bay. Liam held the transparent century-old overlay up to the dim glow of the street lamp, carefully aligning its faded sepia lines with the digital map glowing on his phone screen. Elara leaned in close, her shoulder pressing firmly against his, her dark curls plastered to her cheeks. She traced a path with her trembling finger. The overlay didn't point to another library or a museum, it directed them straight down. The chase moves from the academic to the physical, forcing them to navigate abandoned metro lines beneath the city. "It's an access point," Liam whispered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "A ventilation shaft for a section of the metro grid that was abandoned before the First World War. It's less than 3 blocks from here." Knowing the ruthless collector was likely still prowling the surrounding streets in his black sedan, staying above ground was a death sentence. With a shared, resolute nod, they abandoned the meager shelter of the awning and plunged back into the storm. They found the entrance hidden behind a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters in a dead-end cobblestone alley. It was a heavy circular iron grate, choked with decades of wet leaves and urban debris. Working together, their hands slipping on the wet metal, they managed to heave it aside. A blast of warm, stale air smelling of rusted iron and crushed limestone washed over them. Without hesitation, Liam climbed down the rusted iron rungs set into the concrete shaft, reaching up to help Elara descend into the pitch-black abyss. As Liam slid the heavy grate back into place above them, sealing out the noise of the rain and the dangerous city, a suffocating, absolute silence fell over them. They switched on their phone flashlights, the twin beams cutting through the thick, dusty darkness. They were standing at the edge of a massive, cavernous expanse, a true phantom station. The walls were lined with cracked, decaying white tiles, and faded, ghostly advertisements from the Belle Epoque peeled from the curved ceilings. The air was perfectly still, preserving the forgotten echoes of a Paris that hadn't existed for over a century. The sheer weight of the darkness and the claustrophobia of the subterranean world began to press heavily on Elara. The academic thrill had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primal exhaustion. Her foot caught on a jagged piece of metal buried in the dirt, and she stumbled, a sharp gasp echoing loudly in the vast tunnel. Liam caught her instantly, his strong arms wrapping securely around her waist before she could hit the ground. "I've got you," he murmured softly. He didn't let go. He guided her to a crumbling stone bench on the edge of the forgotten platform. As they sat in the suffocating dark, the beams of their flashlights pointed toward the floor, the terrifying reality of their situation crashed over them. Elara began to shiver violently, the delayed shock of the brutal chase finally taking hold. Seeing her vulnerability, Liam pulled off his damp jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. Through the danger and the suspense, their professional respect transforms into a passionate, shared mission. Liam gently took her cold hands in his thumbs rubbing soothing circles over her knuckles. In the heart of the Parisian underworld, entirely cut off from the rest of humanity, all academic pretenses were stripped away. Elara looked up into his eyes, finding an unshakable anchor in his steady, fiercely protective gaze. The terrifying darkness around them no longer felt like a tomb, but a private sanctuary where their bond was irrevocably forged. "We can stop," Liam whispered, his voice incredibly tender. "We can leave the map here and walk away. Your safety is worth infinitely more than a lost manuscript." Elara shook her head, a defiant spark returning to her dark eyes. She squeezed his hands, her resolve hardening. "He wants to erase history," she replied, her voice steadying. "We are the only ones who can protect it. Together." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Liam's face. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a damp curl from her forehead in a gesture of pure, unguarded affection. They stood up together, their intertwined hands refusing to separate. Pointing their lights down the dark tunnel, they matched the overlay's trajectory. The faded ink lines indicated that this forgotten artery of the city led directly north, climbing steadily upward toward the highest point in Paris. The final answer, and undoubtedly the shadow collector, were waiting for them in the steep, winding labyrinth of Montmartre. The steep, relentless incline of the phantom tunnel tested every ounce of their remaining endurance. For what felt like hours, Elara and Liam climbed through the suffocating darkness, guided only by the fading beams of their phone flashlights and the faded sepia lines of the century-old overlay. The air grew gradually colder and less stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the waking city above. According to Liam's calculations, they were directly beneath the winding, bohemian streets of Montmartre. Finally, the rusted tracks ended abruptly at a sheer concrete wall, interrupted only by a heavy, iron-riveted service hatch. Together, straining against decades of corrosion, they shoved the door open. They tumbled out into the misty, pre-dawn air, gasping for breath in a narrow, cobblestone alleyway draped in thick, dripping ivy. "We made it," Liam whispered, his chest heaving as he quickly pulled the heavy iron door shut behind them, sealing the underworld away. Elara leaned against the damp brick wall, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. She immediately raised the transparent map to the pale, ambient light of a nearby street lamp. Her finger traced the final, intricate spiral of the poet's cipher. "It's not just a general location," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and exhilarating anticipation. "The coordinates point to a specific building right on this block. An old, forgotten artist's studio tucked behind the Rue de l'Abreuvoir. The poet spent his final days there." They moved swiftly through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the lingering drizzle. They found the atelier hidden at the end of a dead-end courtyard, a dilapidated structure with a massive, cracked glass roof. The wooden double doors were chained shut, but Liam quickly spotted a shattered window pane near the ground, just large enough for them to squeeze through. Just as Liam stepped forward to clear the broken glass, a chillingly familiar sound shattered the morning silence. The low, aggressive purr of a high-performance engine echoed down the narrow street. Tires hissed against the wet cobblestones as the sleek black sedan slowly rolled to a stop at the entrance of the courtyard. The heavy car door opened, and the tall, elegant silhouette of the shadow collector stepped out into the mist, his silver-pummeled cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. He had anticipated their final destination. Inside. "Now," Liam hissed, grabbing Elara's hand. They scrambled silently through the broken window, dropping into the pitch-black interior of the abandoned studio just as the beam of the collector's high-powered flashlight swept across the courtyard. The atelier was a graveyard of forgotten art. Towering canvases covered in heavy, dust-caked sheets loomed like ghosts in the dark. The air was thick with the smell of dried linseed oil and rotting wood. They ducked behind a massive, overturned drafting table, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The heavy chains on the front door rattled violently as the collector tested them, followed by the sound of glass crunching under his leather boots as he found their entry point. "You cannot run forever, my young friends," his smooth, venomous voice echoed through the cavernous room. "History belongs to those who can afford it. Hand over the map, and I will let you walk out of here unharmed." Elara ignored him, dropping to her knees in the dust. She desperately scanned the floorboards with her phone's dim light, cross-referencing the exact center of the map's spiral. "Liam, here," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Hidden beneath a rotted Persian rug was a heavy, ornate brass plate embedded directly into the floor. In its center lay a complex combination lock consisting of 3 rotating dials, each engraved with the archaic astrological symbols they had decoded hours ago at the Sorbonne. The heavy footsteps of the collector grew louder, pacing methodically through the maze of covered canvases just a few yards away. "The date," Liam mouthed silently, his face inches from Elara's in the dark. "The date from the very first cipher." Elara nodded frantically. "November 14, 1889. She translated the numbers into the poet's astrological equivalents in her head. With agonizingly slow, precise movements to avoid the slightest metallic click, Liam turned the cold brass dials. 1 turn. 2. 3. The collector was so close they could hear the rustle of his heavy wool overcoat. He paused, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the drafting table they were hiding behind. Liam aligned the final symbol. A soft, beautifully definitive click resonated from beneath the floorboards. With a synchronized, desperate heave, they pulled the heavy brass plate upward, revealing a dark, dry cavity. Inside rested a remarkably preserved, velvet-lined iron box. Liam grabbed it, the weight of the poet's lost legacy finally in his hands. "I know you are there," the collector sneered, stepping around the canvases, raising his silver cane. But Liam and Elara didn't hesitate. Clutching the heavy box to his chest, Liam kicked the drafting table forward with all his might, sending it crashing directly into the collector's path. In the ensuing confusion and cloud of ancient dust, they sprinted blindly toward the back of the studio, bursting through a rotting wooden emergency exit just as the collector stumbled backward. They spilled out onto a steep, winding staircase leading down the hill of Montmartre, the iron box safe in their grasp. The sun was just beginning to break through the grey Parisian clouds, casting a golden, hopeful light over the waking city. They had survived the descent, outsmarted the shadow, and finally secured the truth. The golden light of the Parisian dawn washed over the cobblestone steps of Montmartre as Elara and Liam sprinted down the hill. Their lungs burned with the crisp morning air, but the heavy iron box clutched securely against Liam's chest fueled their final burst of adrenaline. They didn't stop running until they reached the quiet, leafy sanctuary of the Square Louise Michel at the base of the basilica, the waking city sprawling beautifully below them. Collapsing onto a damp, wrought iron bench beneath the budding trees, they finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The aggressive roar of the collector's engine was nowhere to be heard, they had completely lost him in the winding maze of the artist's quarter. Elara looked at Liam, her dark eyes shining with an indescribable mixture of exhaustion and profound victory. With trembling, soot-stained hands, she reached for the ornate box resting on his knees. The heavy latch gave way with a satisfying, resonant click. Inside, protected by centuries-old crimson velvet, lay a meticulously wrapped bundle of dark, preserved oilcloth. As Elara gently peeled back the protective layers, the sweet, intoxicating scent of dried vanilla and ancient parchment bloomed in the fresh morning air. Beneath the oilcloth rested a thick, immaculate stack of premium paper, tightly bound by a brittle, faded blue silk ribbon. Liam leaned in close, his shoulder pressing warmly against hers, as she untied the ribbon and turned the very first page. The elegant, sweeping calligraphy was instantly recognizable, yet it lacked the manic, chaotic strokes that defined the poet's later, supposedly tragic works. Elara began to read the text aloud, her voice a reverent, melodic whisper. These were not the desperate scribblings of a broken mind descending into madness. They were the profound, radiantly beautiful outpouring of a soul deeply and peacefully anchored in love. The highly emotional letters detailed clandestine meetings in sunlit Parisian gardens, shared artistic dreams, and a profound, secret connection that entirely defied the tragic, melancholy narrative that generations of literary historians had falsely woven for over a century. The poet hadn't destroyed his final masterpiece in a fit of grief, he had deliberately hidden it away to protect the woman he fiercely loved from the ruinous, unforgiving scrutiny of 19th-century high society. As she read a stunning, masterful sonnet dedicated entirely to an eternal, enduring bond that transcended time itself, Elara felt Liam's strong hand gently wrap around her waist. She leaned into his embrace, profoundly moved. "Well played, my young friends. Truly." The smooth, chillingly calm voice shattered the morning peace. They jolted upright to see the tall, elegant silhouette of the shadow collector stepping out from behind a row of manicured hedges. He looked utterly exhausted, his custom-tailored overcoat rumpled, his silver-pummeled cane leaning heavily against the gravel path. He had anticipated their descent route. He stared blankly at the priceless letters in Elara's hands. A heavy, painful realization seemed to dawn on him. His infamous ancestor wasn't a tragic victim of historical theft, but rather a noble, silent guardian of this beautiful secret. The heavy silence stretched between the three of them. The collector broke the quiet, his voice tight and trembling with a sudden, overwhelming desperation. "I will give you 2 million euros for that entire bundle right now," he stated flatly, reaching deliberately into his coat to produce a sleek, black leather checkbook. "No one ever needs to know we were here. You both walk away extraordinarily rich today, and my family permanently reclaims its private, untarnished history." Elara looked down at the priceless, world-altering pages resting safely in her hands, then slowly looked up to meet Liam's gaze. The sum was staggering, more than enough to change the trajectory of their lives permanently. But as Liam looked back into her deep, dark eyes, he didn't see a flicker of greed. He saw the exact same fiercely protective, passionate spark he felt burning intensely in his own chest. This wasn't just rare antique paper, it was tangible proof that selfless, enduring love existed. Liam shook his head slowly, his jaw set, stepping deliberately and firmly between Elara and the dangerous man. "Some things," Liam said, his voice ringing with an absolute, unshakable finality, "are worth infinitely more than money. The world deserves to know his heart wasn't broken." Knowing he was in a public park in broad daylight, and unwilling to risk exposing his family's delicate legacy to the authorities, the collector slowly lowered his gaze. He closed his checkbook, turned on his heel, and disappeared silently into the waking Parisian streets. Several bright, peaceful months had passed since that chaotic, terrifying night. The weeping, melancholy skies of their first date had long since cleared, completely replaced by a brilliant, cloudless azure expanse that bathed the historic city in a warm, radiant, honeyed light. The gentle air was highly fragrant with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the fresh, aquatic breeze rolling rhythmically off the Seine. They sat closely together on an ornate bench tucked away in the secluded, vibrant square du Vert Galant. Elara wore a light, flowing summer dress, her dark, chaotic curls catching the vibrant golden sunlight, while Liam, looking relaxed in a crisp linen shirt, had his arm draped comfortably and possessively over her shoulders. They held a beautifully embossed cream-colored envelope bearing the highly prestigious wax seal of the Musée Carnavalet. Inside was a formal, glowing letter of profound gratitude from the chief curator, definitively confirming the authenticity of the lost manuscript and detailing the upcoming permanent exhibition dedicated to the poet's true, romantic story. The letter also discreetly mentioned the successful police investigation into a smuggling ring, directly spearheaded by the detailed information they had provided about the ruthless collector. The frantic, pulse-pounding adrenaline of their very first night together had beautifully evolved into a deep, unshakable, and profoundly peaceful foundation. Liam leaned in close, his lips brushing softly and affectionately against her temple. Elara smiled radiantly, resting her head gently against his chest, listening happily to the steady, deeply reassuring rhythm of his heart. Watching the colorful tourist boats glide peacefully down the glittering, sunlit river, they knew with absolute certainty that their own grand adventure was only just beginning.